I want to introduce Kate Buford. I first met Kate in Oklahoma at the Sac and Fox Reservation in Stroud? Or no, Craig. Okay, we were in Oklahoma. we had been invited, my husband and I had been invited to the Jim Thorpe family reunion, and it was in 2001, and we were so excited to go and meet cousins and relatives. We were invited by Grace, his daughter, and we met Kate there, and she was there with about probably a dozen other biographers. Everybody invited to come and share their testimonials. And it was really a wonderful event. And there was a powwow, and we sat at the at the feet of Jack and Bill Thorpe, who were telling stories about their dad, and they both kind of looked just like their dad, so it was a pretty amazing experience. But anyways, that's where I met Kate. And then over the years, because she had written the biography of Burt Lancaster, I believe that's how she got sort of intrigued by Thorpe, because, you know, Burt Lancaster was the star of the movie about Jim Thorpe. And so that's really how her interest was developed. And she wrote a biography of Thorpe called Native American Son. And she did a lot of her research up here, so we had a lot of times to spend together. And so after she finished her book, she continues to work on other projects, and she is a feature writer for various magazines. Are you still writing for Guitar Magazine?
Bluegrass Unlimited.
Bluegrass Unlimited. Yeah. So I mean, she's a woman of many interests and very talented. So I'm very pleased to present Kate Buford.
Thank you, Barb, very much. That's a very generous introduction. We are working with our PowerPoint here. All right, thank you very much. What I wanted to do today is really a pretty visually based presentation, since we're talking about representation of American Indians in media. And what I wanted to do to start out with was to refresh everyone's memory, if they've forgotten how great Jim Thorpe was, as probably the most famous graduate internationally of Carlisle, and what he had done before arriving in Hollywood in 1930, what kind of person he was when he arrived there. Then I'll discuss a bit what life was like for him in Hollywood, very active life. For me, it was the big discovery of this biography. No one had really looked at what Jim Thorpe did in Hollywood. It's as if his life ended in 1912. Whereas, of course, he went on to do so many other things and had this whole other career in Hollywood. So it's great fun for me, having already done a book about Hollywood with Burt Lancaster. It was really intriguing to jump back in. Then the last 18 minutes or so will be screening, as Grace has referred to, the next to last episode of Battling with Buffalo Bill, the 1931 talkie serial, which was Thorpe's first movie role in Hollywood. It also has Richard Davis in it. So you'll see two Carlisle graduates in Battling with Buffalo Bill. So let's see if I can figure this out here. Thorpe. All right. Thorpe arrived in Carlisle actually in 1904 and was put out on the outing program. He was from Oklahoma, was registered with the Sac and Fox tribe. It was actually, as he said, more Potawatomi than anything else. Was 5/8 Indian, the rest was white. The Thorpe name is from his white grandfather, who actually was one of, not the grandfather, but an ancestor of that. Thorpe was one of the founding fathers of the town of New Haven, Connecticut. So here he is, all ready to play football. He was already tabbed by Pop Warner, the famous coach of Carlisle, to be on the track and field team, but Jim wanted to play football. And as you can see, probably a little bit if you look closely, his socks never matched in any photograph. They don't match here either, but he's ready, you can tell. He's ready to go. I love this shot. By 1911, well, he takes time out for a while. This is a different slideshow. Anyway. In 1909 and 1910, he left Carlisle never intending to return. He wanted to break into Major League Baseball. And he went to play not with a semi-pro team, not with a Twilight League team, but with a minor league team under the aegis of professional baseball, 2 teams in North Carolina. He was not that good and was not scouted for the majors. Pop Warner kept track of him, and thought, oh, I want him to come back because he was such a good track and field star in the 1909 season. Pop Warner convinced him to come back to Carlisle in 1911. He's bigger, he's heavier, he goes back to play football and becomes a phenomenon. And on the collegiate level, which Carlisle played with at that time, there was no NCAA, or I think the NCAA was 1 year old at this point. There were no rules for who played who, so Pop Warner was this aggressive promoter, and he got Carlisle to play against Harvard, Penn, Syracuse, Georgetown, and of course he beat West Point, beats them all. Thorpe is a huge, phenomenal football player, as well as track and field in 1911. Here's the Carlisle backfield, Jim at the far right. He was a fabulous kicker. He won a game against Harvard in 1911 with 4 kicks. He could kick from the 50-yard line both ways to the goalposts, well into middle age. Phenomenal kicker. So now Pop Warner gets a chance. He goes, okay, the 5th modern Olympiad. Again, the modern Olympics are, as you can guess from the name, brand new. Revival of the ancient games in Greece. The 5th Olympiad is going to be in Stockholm in 1912. Warner already knows he has a phenomenal track and field star as well. That season of spring of 1912, before the summer games, Jim is breaking all kinds of records at the Penn relays and everywhere. So here he is trying out with the C for Carlisle there on his shirt for the Olympic tryout. He's trying out for the decathlon and the pentathlon. The decathlon was brand new. The pentathlon, of course, was a revival of the ancient multi-sport competition, both designed to showcase the ultimate athlete. But it was assumed that a Brit or a Scandinavian would win these 2 events, not an American Indian by any stretch of the imagination. Here is the entry form, and this is important for the athletics, for the decathlon. For all athletes entering that event, they had to sign this form. And in the lower left, signed by Jim Thorpe, you can see his signature. He attests to the fact that he has never accepted money for playing sports in any way. Well, he had, of course, in North Carolina in 1909 and 1910. This will erupt into a huge scandal, but you won't get into all of it, but this is important for how the rest of his life goes and when he arrives in Hollywood. But he signs this form here, little red arrow. He competes in Stockholm. Here he is with the pole vault in the decathlon. He calibrates his performance in each of these 10 events, counting very intelligently. He didn't do too well in the pole vault on purpose because he didn't want to get injured and compromise his competition in some of the other events. He wins the pentathlon first by a huge margin, and then he wins the decathlon. He is a sensation at the Olympics. He really defines the Olympic superstar, the person we look for now every 4 years. We look for that unbelievable dark horse that comes out of nowhere and wins events and astonishes us. Thorpe was the first person to set that gold standard and makes him the first international celebrity athlete. And again, remember, this is the dawn of sports in many ways. Football is brand new, the modern Olympics are brand new. Baseball is pretty well organized. It's not that new. Basketball is brand new. I love this picture, talking about what Jackie was talking about, analyzing a picture. The socks don't match again. But here he is, just after the last event of the decathlon. We take a t-shirt for granted now, but then no one wore t-shirts. They were like underwear. But he could walk off a field today. He looks completely modern, in the best shape of his life. And he's just finished, and he is the best in the whole world. As the King of Sweden said, the most wonderful athlete in the world. He's the toast of the world, comes back to Carlisle, and here he is with Pop Warner on the left, Louis Tewanima, a Hopi Indian who had competed in the marathon, and Thorpe. He hated these public displays. He hated the Heroes Parade in New York. He hates this. He's scouting the whole way through. But he has decided to continue at Carlisle to finish. Now he feels a sense of obligation to his people. He gets a couple of family members to come to Carlisle. He has a new vision of himself with this newfound celebrity. But what happens is, in January of 1913, 6 months after his triumph, it's revealed in a newspaper scoop that he did indeed accept money for playing sports. And the big threshold issue then, like doping is now, was amateurism. You had to be supposedly a Simon Pure amateur, which meant never to have played for money or coached for money. He was summarily stripped of his medals and his trophies within a week. They were sent back to Stockholm, and Pop Warner immediately negotiated with a cut for himself a contract with the New York Giants. And he is in the back row, right there. The problem was the New York Giants would be like signing up. Remember, we didn't do that well in baseball. Signing up with some combination of the Red Sox, the Yankees, and the San Francisco Giants, never having done that well in the minors. Even Jackie Robinson got a chance to warm up. He doesn't do that well in baseball initially, but another discovery of this book is that by 1919, he's hitting as well as Joe Jackson and Ty Cobb. Here he is as a Giant, looking a little less confident than he once was. And here's his manager, John McGraw, who was his nemesis. We'll go through these quickly. But he also takes up football. Again, this is important to remember why he's so revered when he arrives in Hollywood. He starts to play football, professional football, as opposed to collegiate football, was on nobody's radar except a couple of towns in Ohio. And he goes to coach and play for the Canton Bulldogs. And if you ever wonder why the Professional Football Hall of Fame is in Canton, it's because of Jim Thorpe. And he puts that sport on the map, coaching and playing for the Canton Bulldogs. And he makes, because he's playing, newspaper reporters follow professional football. Not as they do now, but they begin to notice because the great Jim Thorpe is playing football. Back to 1916, he has married Iva Miller, one of his classmates at Carlisle, and this is the first of their 4 children, 1 son and 3 daughters. This little guy, Jim Thorpe Jr., Jim was crazy about, but he will die of inflammatory rheumatism at age 3. And Thorpe's never the same afterwards. He played with this little guy, he loved him, and he'll never be quite as close with any of his other children. But that picture is heartbreaking. Here we are, a little pre-Hollywood picture. In 1922, he does spring training. He's gone to the minors now with the Pacific Coast League with the Portland Beavers. And they're doing spring training in Los Angeles, and here he is with Douglas Fairbanks, no less, on the set of Robin Hood. And you can't see in this picture, but he's holding a sword, as if he's showing Jim Thorpe how to use a sword. Love it. And here we are to Hollywood. That's a fast gallop through Jim Thorpe's career. He arrives in Hollywood in 1930. It's the Depression. He has no money. He's divorced Iva. He's now married Frida Kirkpatrick, and they have 4 sons. And he has to provide for them. And he arrives in Hollywood as many of the great athletes of the 1920s, the so-called golden age of American sports. They all made, many of them, John Mack Brown was one, made their way to Hollywood because their name could get some recognition. They were athletes. They knew how to use their bodies well in a coordinated manner. But he doesn't get work in the movies right away. He has to resort to a sort of a ditch digging job, digging the foundation for the LA County Hospital. And some enterprising reporter snaps a picture of him with a shovel in his hand, digging a ditch. And this goes all over the world, as the most famous world athlete is now reduced to digging ditches. But this was a depression, and people could sympathize with that. The studio saw the picture and thought, oh my gosh, we could use this fellow. And so, here he is. I love this picture. Again, thinking of Jackie, this is a very interesting picture to pick apart. Tom Mix is on the left, one of the great silent film cowboys. White hat, he's the hero, of course. And on the other side is Jim, dressed in a regalia as he never wore in real life, but this is the requisite Plains Indian regalia. What's in the middle of them? The camera. This joins the 2 of them. The camera will make the cowboy more than he ever was, and will make the Indian less than he ever was. And with the California brown hills in the background and the sunshine. So let me elaborate on that for a little bit. What we're going to do, actually, for the last 18 minutes or so is, and Grace mentioned this, the movie, we're going to screen the next to last episode of Battling in Buffalo Bill, the 1931 serial. That was Thorpe's first movie and one of the early talkie serials. And it has every cliche you could possibly imagine in that one little episode. Now, Thorpe arrives in Hollywood as the most famous of the huge Indian diaspora that arrives to Hollywood, just like the sports stars. They arrive in Hollywood because with the advent of sound in particular, there already were an established Western tradition in Hollywood, but sound elevated all of it to be much more exciting. You know, the thumping hoofs, I'll get to that in a second. Thorpe gathers this whole group of Indians around him, and I'll get into that a little bit in a second. Because he's so famous, he's tapped for a spokesman for Indian causes, and people naturally gravitate to him because he is this incredibly famous athlete. What would be called the celluloid Indian, pretend Indian, or the white man's Indian, was firmly in place when Jim arrived in Hollywood. The movies were maintaining the pattern of Black Hawk, Sitting Bull, Geronimo, and others. As Indians showcased to perform what film historian Beverly R. Singer describes as, quote, humiliating demonstrations that reenacted the culture of genocide they had fought to prevent. Thomas Edison's first penny arcade peep shows in the 1890s featured Indian dances. His 1894 single-scene movie, Sioux Ghost Dance, was made in his New Jersey studios 4 years after Wounded Knee. The week that Jim became the world's most famous athlete in Stockholm in 1912, a one-reel silent movie, The Fall of Black Hawk, was released by the American Film Manufacturing Company. Moving Picture World summed it up as a depiction of, quote, those stirring events which led to the wanton slaughter of countless white settlers, end quote. Later that year, Indian Massacre, another movie, portrayed the glorious quest of the white settlers for land in the West and the sad plight of the Indians as a result. The last scene was of a silhouetted Indian mother praying by her child's grave, a symbolic farewell to what was seen then as the dying race. 2 years later, Cecil B. DeMille had directed The Squaw Man, the first feature movie made in Hollywood, in an old barn at the corner of Sunset and Vine. D.W. Griffith would make more than 30 Indian-themed movies. There had been a quick backlash. In the December 1911 issue of the Carlisle School publication, The Red Man, Jim would have read a protest against, quote, the untrue and libelous brand of moving pictures of Indian life. The majority of these pictures are not only without foundation in fact, but do not even have Indians to pose for them. White men or Mexicans usually pose as Indians, with blackened faces, wigs, and Indian costume. Their actions and gestures are absurdly grotesque and exaggerated. And as Jim read that, it took it very much to heart, as we'll see. In reaction to another movie, Lo, the Poor Indian, a delegation of Chippewa went to Washington, D.C. to demand that President Taft curb the movie's distortion of Indians. A group of Western Cheyenne, Shoshone, and Arapaho especially objected to The Curse of the Red Man, another movie in which an Indian boarding school graduate and football player returns home to his people in a suit and tie, only to be shunned. He turns to drink and is finally killed by a white posse. The persistence of the Western suggested at the least an old unease about the Indian. A significant number of silent films portrayed Indians as noble and vanishing, victims of white oppression, notably Griffith's 1910 Ramona, based on the Helen Hunt Jackson novel. When the movie business permanently shifted from the East Coast to California in the 1910s, directors and their producers actively recruited Indians from both the Wild West shows that Grace spoke about and the reservations as technical advisors, stunt persons, and actors, but not as directors or stars. Except for a few movies such as The Vanishing American in 1925, by the end of the 1920s, just before Jim arrives, the Western was largely a predictable, minor genre that glorified the conquest of the land and indigenous peoples of the West. The land and indigenous peoples of the West. After 1929, with the advent of the talkies, sound further enhanced Indian attacks with thunking arrows, crackling rifle shots, and what one historian called, quote, a screaming, savage, burning, pillaging, raping, scalping, and generally being picturesque. Indians now had predominantly become the bad guys, and producers and casting directors gave little thought to authenticity in the race to turn out product to meet the renewed demand for Westerns with the talkies. Buckskin, see here, buckskin, feathers, moccasins, a bow and arrow, a tomahawk, a rifle, and a pony. An entire people was frozen on film, as Grace was mentioning, as a Plains Indian in the so-called Indian Wars of the last half of the 19th century. No other American minority, as American literature and culture scholar Donald L. Kaufman would suggest, quote, has had to pay such a high price as a caretaker of a national dream, of having a deprived present, of being not people, but a figment of history, always in the making and never coming to an ethnic rest. Indians were depicted as communicating with grunts, a made-up Indian language, and pidgin English. They scowled and had rigid, statue-like bodies. The camera was always positioned to look down, not up, at the inferior who always lost. The talkie Western was largely relegated to the B, or budget, level of Hollywood output, the lower half of the double bill. With exceptions, that would be Jim's product level. The pictures were made cheap and fast on Poverty Row, so called for the strip of studios on Sunset Boulevard, including Republic, Monogram, and RKO, that churned out quickie westerns, serials, and adventure flicks from the 1920s until the mid-1940s. Its off-screen center was the corner of Sunset and Gower, known in the industry as Gower Gulch, because the costume cowboy and Indian extras congregated there, either between sets or hoping for a job. It was a volatile, competitive, close-knit community, into which Jim fit very comfortably. He had been a nomad for much of the last decade and a half. His fellow extras were sort of a new team playing together on the Sandlot set of the movies. Indians streamed into Gower Gulch from all over the country. The fakery, an attractive alternative for many to the poverty and prejudice beyond the orange groves. The celluloid distortions produced what later analysts would call infra-politics, a resistance to the dominant culture that works quietly, transcending traditional political organization and means of protest. The industry's wage discrimination, this was an important issue, huge issue at the time. Indian extras earned an average of $5.30 a day, half what non-Indians earned. And denigration of their image produced in many of the so-called California Indians a distinctive unity and response. They worked both individually and through various Indian organizations formed in the 1920s and 30s to rectify the pay difference and to encourage more accurate portrayals of Indians on screen, though with very limited success. Many Indians also found, ironically, that playing fake Indians, and this is one of the most, of many interesting things about writing this book, was to discover, as we'll get into in a second, that Thorpe discovered more of his Indian identity in Hollywood, the most unlikely setup that he had since leaving Carlisle. They found, ironically, that playing the Indian awakened in themselves their authentic Indian identities and cultures. Jim would come to feel more Indian than he had since leaving Carlisle. Of course, he'd been in the white world since leaving in 1913. The most talented and enterprising of the Hollywood Indians, including Jim, capitalized on the attention and celebrity and developed powwows, lecture tours, and performances focused on Indian culture. Some of this entertainment and pedagogy was as cliched and stereotypical as the worst Western serials, but the best of it was thoughtful, accurate, and sincere, and helped create an early foundation for later, more activist Indian groups from the 1940s to the Red Power movement of the 60s and 70s. Concurrent efforts by the Hollywood Indians to teach their languages, ceremonies, and rituals to their children, as Jim did and his friends did, also anticipated by decades much more organized and widespread efforts to reweave the hole left by centuries of wars, removals, cultural identity theft, denigration, and ignorance. Jim had a very good friend in Hollywood who he'd grown up with in Shawnee, Seal Blanchard. And Seal and Lee had arrived in Hollywood just before Jim, and he lived very near them, so they formed this group, and they would have parties and powwows, and people would congregate. And Seal her husband actually, Lee, made many of the headdresses. I mean, over several hundred of them for Hollywood studios. Would sort of craft these headdresses and became a sort of cottage industry. Jim's probably wearing one of Seal's ones right there. Jim saw both a career advantage and a personal satisfaction in using his famous name and Indian identity to help his people. He had few illusions about his movie career. While Chief Red Fox, a nephew of Crazy Horse and an early Carlisle student, would describe his feelings about his Hollywood career with raw frankness, he said, "I wanted to go down to a clean stream and wash away my duplicity." Jim summed up his on-screen performance with terse humor, "I was lost." Like older Hollywood Indian performers, Richard Davis and Luther Standing Bear, both in Carlisle's first class, Jim was called on to speak up for local Indian events and causes. He had publicly protested a California bill to segregate Mexican and Indian children in California public schools. Can you believe that? He was again in the news when he presided over a meeting open to all Indians living in the Los Angeles area to hear a report on Indian lawsuits involving the return of more than $300 million to the Five Nations. Under his leadership, more than 250 Indians gathered for a powwow in June to protest the use of blacks and Mexicans as Indians in movie roles. What Jim then does with Seal Blanchard, his friend from Shawnee, he forms his own casting company. And he and Seal was wonderful help. She helped me a great deal before she unfortunately died about 3 years ago. But she and Jim would draw, they knew so many of the Indians in the Hollywood area, and they came obviously from many different tribes, different nations with different skills. So Seal made up like a spreadsheet of the different Indians and what their respective skills were. And then Jim would pressure the studios to hire Indians to play the Indian role. Even though they were stereotypical roles, this was the Depression. It was work, and they wanted the work. The studios were going to make Westerns. Jim wanted Indians to play the Indians. So he and Seal had a thriving studio system, and Jim would get the calls from the studios, and then he would go out from this stable of Indians and get them placed in the different movies. In the late 30s, the Indian community in Hollywood watched movie opportunities shrink even more rapidly and formed in response to Los Angeles Indian Center as a meeting place and welfare agency. Victor Daniels, aka Chief Thundercloud, Tonto in the movie version of The Lone Ranger, and Harold J. Smith, also known as Jay Silverheels, a Mohawk, was later cast as Tonto in TV's The Lone Ranger, were among the handful of Indians in Hollywood who made a viable living in the movies. Jim was mostly playing uncredited roles. He was in at least 70 credited movies that I was able to track down. Could have been double that. Many of the records for these Gower Gulch quickies were lost. By the end of the 1930s, Daniels, who claimed to be Oklahoma Cherokee, though that has been questioned, would unsuccessfully file a petition with the DIA in Washington for official recognition of the expatriate Hollywood Indian tribe. As a tribe, tongue-in-cheek, they called themselves the DeMille Indians. So Jim redoubled his efforts. Here's the headline: Jim Thorpe takes warpath. Fake Indians taking film work from real ones, he complains. Headlined a 1936 article about Jim's visit to the U.S. Attorney in Los Angeles to protest. With the Department of Labor, he'd been checking casting lists to see if Mexicans and Italians were claiming to be Indian, and said that less than 50% of Indian extras were bona fide. It's unfair to the Indian, he said. There are only a few pictures each year that we can work in. And when they use white men, it just means we can't make a living. Indians were even underbidding each other to get the movie work. His recommendation: hire only Thorpe's certified Indians from his casting company. But by then, Jim had serious competition from one of his own, Carlisle's Luther Standing Bear. Now one of the most distinguished Indian actors, author of 4 books on Indian history and culture, and teacher at the University of California in Los Angeles. He formed the non-profit Indian Actors Association, IAA, in 1936. He would lead it until his death in 1939, when another Carlisle alumnus, William Haslett, took over the operation. The IAA objected to screen Indians being made to, quote, talk and grunt like morons, and the unequal pay. Eventually, the salary discrepancy was adjusted, if not completely eliminated. In May of 1939, the LA Times Sunday magazine ran another multi-photo spread reporting that Jim was a member of a group organizing, quote, a new tribe of culture-preserving Hollywood Indians. Its purpose, prompted by a dying wish of Luther Standing Bear, was to save intertribal sign language and the fast vanishing knowledge of pictographic writing, as well as to study, I'm quoting now, to study and gravely act out ancient mysteries, ceremonials, and dances. Tribal members were to be at least 1/4 Indian, meetings were to be entirely private, and all were to use an English translation of their Indian names. Jim had not used his, which was Bright Path, in decades, not since leaving Carlisle. A few months later, most of the tribe, including Jim, as a charter member, joined the Native Red Men, yet another group of Indian actors formed to improve working conditions for their members and to teach the younger Indians something of the old Indian life. Jim actively did this with his 4 boys now in Los Angeles. The sons told me they vividly remember their Indian gear, the headdresses, the dances, the powwows. So Jim, it's a fascinating shift. He embraces his Indian identity in a way that was deeply, deeply felt, and that he had not had a chance to access for decades. And oddly enough, he finds it in the Hollywood, the unlikely locale of Hollywood. This is a group of one of the powwows that he organized. And you can see Iron Eyes Cody peeking out from behind, who of course is not really Indian, but there's Jim, and gathered around with one of these events that he organized. I would like to screen one of the episodes, as I said, from Battling of Buffalo Bill. This was one of the 12-part serial westerns that came out. The kids would troop down to the local movie theater every Saturday afternoon to watch the next cliffhanging episode. This is Jim's first movie role. He plays Swift Arrow. As I said, he made at least 70 movies. It was really interesting, tracking more down than ever actually been tracked down. But he could have made many, many more. He played an extra often, and they were uncredited, so it's almost impossible to track down all the movies he was in. But he made a whole other career after this amazing athletic career in the movies in Hollywood. Battling with Buffalo Bill was made in 1931, which was the first year that sound technology was universal throughout all American movie theaters. Even in 1930, only half of American theaters were wired for sound. So by 1931, they all are. So we're barely out of the silent era. Keep that in mind when you see this. So you'll see lots of stock footage from old silent westerns, especially of the Indian environments, the teepee encampment, the action shots. And if a shot looks particularly, whoops, we're going here. We're not going further than Hollywood. If a shot looks particularly grainy and kind of out of place, it's probably a stock footage from a silent movie that they've just grafted sound onto. Because it's cheap. They want to they have to turn out one a week, so we're not looking to spend any money. Look at the credits carefully when we get there. The movie is very loosely based on the book by William F. Cody, Buffalo Bill, called The Great West That Was. Very loosely, I should say, based. There are, as I said, 2 former Carlisle students in the cast. Jim is Swift Arrow, Richard Davis, his son. Richard Davis plays Chief Thunderbird. Thunderbird, Richard Davis plays a so-called good Indian in this movie. And he's also identified in the credits as the, quote, Indian authority. And I will be very interested, in light of what Grace said, he's speaking a language. Now, I don't know what it is myself, and it should be Cheyenne, yeah. So perhaps Grace or someone can translate, because the joke was often they would speak whatever they wanted to, and say, who knows what, and no one could correct them, but we'll see. There's several silent film cowboy stars here too, including Francis Ford. He plays the bad guy, Rodney, who is director John Ford's brother, who would direct, of course, many epic westerns, and Thorpe would be in his last one, Wagon Master, in 1950. That's not Ford's last film, it's Jim's last film in 1950. When we talk about the miscasting and the use of anybody vaguely ethnic looking, the sort of bad guy in there, Green, is played by George Regas, who is in fact born in Greece, but he's supposed to be some kind of half-breed. So that was all too typical. Also in this episode, which we'll get to, I guess we could start on that, look for just about every cliche, this takes a little bit of doing here, that we associate with the original Hollywood Western. Just start that. I can read it. Bear with us here. We're Buffalo Bill rides the white horse, of course, back and forth. So tell me, just keep going. And I won't bother to decipher the plot. It's basically small town, gold is discovered, bad guys, good guys. There are Blackfeet, are supposed to be bad Indians, and the Cheyenne are the good Indians. Okay. Just to let you see what the chapter headings are, as to how they're being stereotyped, captured by redskins, between hostile tribes, the savage horde, sentenced to death, the death trap, etc. It's a Cheyenne vengeance at the end. We're going to show the flaming death, number 11. You can see how the hypnotic and really persuasive imagery and pacing of these movies inculcated an entire generation with ideas about not only the white settlers, but certainly even more the Indians. So, did anyone catch the language? Is it Cheyenne? It is Cheyenne. Okay. Were they saying what they said, or? Oh, okay. We'll never know. Anyway, thank you very much.